Hello, I'm Eric. I run a book blog and YouTube channel called Lonesome Reader, and I've been participating in the Trollope Society's Big Read for Anthony Trollope's novel Doctor Thorne. And so I'm going to give my summary and some thoughts and reactions to chapters 13 through 24 of this book. So I'm relatively new to reading Trollope. This is only the third book I've read by him, but I've been finding it really interesting learning about his style through reading his books and getting into his particular style of writing, as well as the subject matters he covers and obviously the particular stories and plots of these novels. So I'm going to give a summary of what happens in these chapters, as well as commenting on some of the interesting ideas and themes surrounding these various chapters, and some of the very particular characters and the character development that occurs within these chapters, and some of the very engaging and funny scenes that occur in this section of the book. So we're really getting into the plot of this novel within these chapters, and it begins coming off from chapter 12, where we have a very funny scene where Dr. Filgrave storms out of the Scatcherd household, being very offended that he's been kept waiting and then dismissed, and then that Dr. Thorne arrives. And that's a very funny scene. And so it's interesting how chapter 13 follows on from that, of Dr. Thorne engages in a conversation with Sir Roger, where he tries to convince, well, he successfully convinces Sir Roger to give money to the Greshams, and he also reveals to Sir Roger here the true identity of his sister Mary's eldest child, who, as we know from previous chapters, Sir Roger has made out his will to give his estate to Mary's eldest child should he die and his son die. And Dr. Thorne feels compelled to reveal this information that he's been keeping secret because he knows that his ward Mary will become the inheritor of this estate if it's revealed that she is in fact Sir Roger's niece, as well as Dr. Thorne's own niece. And so it's quite interesting to see this Sir Roger's reaction to it, because he wants to have a relationship with Mary now that he knows her identity, and so wants to meet her, and he wants to give gifts to her and give money to her. But this is something Dr. Thorne tries to shield her from, and it's sort of an interesting thing about his character, that he is perhaps slightly overprotective of Mary in his care for her, and so yeah, it's interesting, his tactic, and how he obviously wants to protect her because she is a bastard child, and so he doesn't want her to be scorned by society. But at the same time, even though Sir Roger wants to accept her, and he remarks how he's never heard of someone being ashamed of a wealthy relative like he is to Mary, but that Dr. Thorne still wants to protect her from her and not want to have him meet her. So yeah, I thought that was a really interesting situation that he made there. And then we go on in the next chapter, where Dr. Thorne visits the Greshams, and how he has an interaction there with Lady Arabella, which I think is quite interesting, in that he is treating Lady Arabella for suspected cancer that she has, and how she hasn't revealed this to anybody else, that she has this medical condition, but she does confide in it to Dr. Thorne. And in our discussion with the reading group as part of the Big Read, that this was remarked as this makes Lady Arabella, who is otherwise quite a hard and scheming character, it shows a slightly more sympathetic side to her. And I was wondering if this was going to be developed a bit more, but someone else made a very interesting point, that Trollope really uses this as a plot device, that Lady Arabella has to welcome Dr. Thorne back into her household, even though we have this argument, because another big part of this chapter is Lady Arabella tells Dr. Thorne that she doesn't want Mary to visit the Gresham household anymore because of Frank's relationship and desire for Mary, and what she describes as Mary's allurements. And Dr. Thorne naturally takes great offense to this and fights with Lady Arabella and sort of storms out of the household. But we also have some interactions between Dr. Thorne and Mr. Gresham, who is very relieved that he is going to be loaned some more money by Sir Roger to give to Augusta's intended, so that she can marry Mr. Moffat. So there's that plot development there. And there's also mention of Frank, how he's soon going to be going to the De Courcys to meet Miss Dunstable, who his family is trying to arrange for him to get together with and marry because she is a very wealthy individual. Then we move on to the De Courcy Castle and a scene there and a party there that's being held. And it's very funny how Trollope describes this landscape and De Courcy Castle as a very dull environment. And he repeatedly describes it as a dull place, as well as obviously being a very grand place, but a very dull one. And we get a little glimpse here of, I think, the wider society, where we get the point of view of an ostler or a stableman who's commenting upon changes to the landscape and changing technology from horses to the power of steam, and how this is sort of making his job redundant and changing the landscape around him. And so I think it's really interesting how Trollope gives this snippet of changes in the wider society through this lens and through this particular point of view of this man speaking in a vernacular voice about his situation and his point of view, and how obviously these technological developments are for the betterment of wider society and moving forward in general as a civilization, but also had these consequences on the individual level of some jobs being made redundant and changes which people are slightly uncomfortable with and take some getting used to. So I really enjoy how he gives that little insight into the wider society. And we also get some glimpses about the question of Mr. Moffat's place in Parliament, and he gives a description of the character of Mr. Moffat, which I find very funny, and how Trollope is so skilled at making these very backhanded compliments to some of his characters, which you can tell Trollope is quite critical of. And he describes Mr. Moffat as being good looking enough had he had a little more expression in his face, and I love how he gives that description. And we also get some wider descriptions about the differences in political parties of the different Whigs, and we have a wonderful appearance of the cowed Bishop of Barchester, whose convivial relationship with Mrs. Proudie doesn't brighten the dullness of De Courcy Castle. And I love how he describes that, and getting this little glimpse of the Bishop of Barchester, because I find his relationship with Mrs. Proudie very funny and very endearing. And then we also have the question of Mr. Moffat voting to admit Jews into Parliament. And this is something, as a contemporary reader, I find quite bracing, and quite shocking to read, the question of whether Jewish people would be allowed into Parliament, but was obviously a debate at the time. And it's really interesting thinking about that through the lens of current politics and current British politics, because obviously it's still a debate about questions of anti-Semitism within current British political parties. So I found that really interesting to think about. Then we move on in chapter 16 to Miss Dunstable and get more of a look and description of this wonderful character who I think is one of the most fascinating Trollope characters that I've read about so far. She's very conscious of her independence based upon her wealth, and conscious that men are trying to woo her because of her wealth, even though they try to use sly and underhanded methods to get her affection and don't claim that they're interested in her wealth, but she knows better than that. And she really shocks Frank by describing her travels and how she has many lovers along her travels, and how this is quite shocking for the young and naive Frank to hear about. But she clarifies to him that she doesn't want plenty of lovers because, quote, one good lance in the olden days was always worth more than a score of ordinary men at arms. I love that description. It's so funny, and such a great like embodiment of her character and her way of looking at things. And I also like how Trollope points out the differences in ages between them, because Frank is in his early 20s and Miss Dunstable is in her 30s. Now, this isn't, by contemporary standards, a very big age difference and wouldn't matter so much now, but I think this is interesting for two reasons, because we are getting this very much through Frank's point of view as a young man who, seeing a woman in her 30s, when you're in your early 20s, anyone over 30 seems like quite old, and it's on the brink of old age. And he describes how she seems like on the brink of old age to him, which is obviously absolutely ridiculous, but through the lens of a young man, that's his point of view. But also I think Trollope is showing the condition of women within society at this time. An unmarried woman in her 30s is considered sort of past her prime, which again is obviously ridiculous, but was the sort of perception at the time. So then in the next chapter, we go on to a slightly broader picture of politics and this race for parliament and the expenses involved in campaigning to have a seat in parliament. And we get this through the battle between Moffat versus Scatcherd in this parliamentary battle, and trying to gain votes, and how they use different, I guess you could say, political strategists or people to try to help them achieve this position, and the question of bribery. And obviously bribery isn't allowed and would be greatly frowned upon, but how they can try to finesse that through a character named Mr. Ready Palm, who hasn't decided in his vote, and both parties are trying to woo him to their side, and someone from Sir Roger's side doesn't bribe him, but they describe it as settling a bill for Mr. Ready Palm, and in that way convinces him to vote for Sir Roger. And obviously this causes difficulties for the decision of Sir Roger being elected to Parliament in later chapters. And and we also get a very funny scene here where Sir Roger makes a very spirited speech to the voters who are really on his side and who really connect and relate to him, and then a speech from Mr. Moffat which doesn't go so well, and he doesn't connect with, and he's sort of stumbling over his words, and it's very awkward. But it's very funny how Trollope portrays that awkwardness, and how unsuccessful poor Mr. Moffat is in this, and how he actually gets a rotten egg thrown at him because of his efforts and his stumbled efforts. And so this is also showing how Trollope has preferences for characters over others. I mean, he's already sort of mocked Mr. Moffat's appearance, but yeah, we get this sort of further mockery of him in this scene. And then, of course, Scatcherd is declared the winner of this parliamentary battle. Then we, in chapter 18, we get a bit more about Miss Dunstable and how aware she is that people are after her for her fortune. And we get George and John de Courcy. They decide that George should try to woo her as well by writing a letter to her. And of course, she sees through that letter right away. And we also get how Mr. Moffat wants to woo Miss Dunstable and make a play for her, even though he is already engaged himself to the Gresham's daughter. And I think this is Trollope also showing how, it's quite reasonable to be quite judgmental towards Mr. Moffat, because he, is obviously not being very loyal to the engagement he made, and is trying to woo this other woman who for mercenary reasons, because of her wealth and money. And he tries to connect with her by saying that they come from the same place as each other. They've sort of worked their way up in the world and come into a fortune through their own efforts. But of course, Miss Dunstable sees through this right away again, and she makes a very canny decision where she says to Mr. Moffat, when she realizes that he's about to declare his affection for her and desire to have her in marriage, that she doesn't want to have him say anything without Miss Gresham being there. And of course he can't declare his desire to marry her with Miss Gresham being there, since he's already engaged to Miss Gresham. So I think that shows Miss Dunstable's real cleverness in sort of playing these men, that she's very aware of their desire to marry her just for her money. And we also get a bit of plot information here where Mr. Moffat declares his intention to petition the vote for his place in Parliament. Then in chapter 19, we get what a sort of aside from the main action of the plot, to go to a different location and to give what I think is quite a funny scene, where Frank and Miss Dunstable's other suitors go to Gatherum Castle, where the Duke of Omnium is holding a dinner party, and Frank, in his youthful exuberance, is very excited to be invited to the Duke's party and thinks that, he's going to become part of the Duke's social circle and have a personal relationship with the Duke. But we find that the Duke only shows up to his own dinner party immediately before the food is served, and then he leaves immediately after the coffee is served, and doesn't really speak to any of his guests at all, just sort of holds a stately position at the head of the table and doesn't interact with them. And Frank is very offended by this, because he expects to be spoken to by the Duke, and since he was invited, and Mr. Athill takes him under his wing and starts having a conversation with him and sits with him at dinner. And to Mr. Athill, this is all very normal, this behavior, but to Frank, it's very offensive, and it's very funny that relationship, and how Mr. Athill says, like, oh yes, of course I'm very good friends with the Duke, although he's never really spoken to him either, and his only interaction with him has been at these dinner parties. And I think this is interesting, how Trollope is showing Frank's introduction to wider society and the customs of this larger society, and how people relate to each other, and how he, in his naivety, assumes that they'll have these personal relationships, but really the relationships are all based upon people's social standing, and so whether they're invited to these dinner parties or not is based upon that social standing, rather than any actual personal relationship that people have with each other. And so I think that's quite interesting to show, as well as being a very funny scene where all the other men in the party are quite delighted because the Duke has very good wine and they've just enjoyed drinking his wine, whereas Frank is sort of fuming to himself because he hasn't had this personal relationship with the Duke. Then in chapter 20, we get what I think is quite a tender scene between Frank and Miss Gresham, where she forces him to admit that he wants to marry her, but which she assumes is based on her money, and of course it is. He is being coerced into trying to have an engagement with her based on her money, but to Frank, he's not really interested in that at all, and he admits this to her. And after there is this frank exchange between them, I think there's this lovely, genuine friendship that occurs between them. And Trollope describes how they have this conversation late into the night, where they're just really enjoying each other's company in this very sincere level. And so even though I think Frank is very naive, and but he is very genuine in his interaction and is very forthright in what he wants, and is staying true to what he wants, as well as Miss Gresham insisting upon this sincerity in her interactions. And of course we get the comic thing of Lady de Courcy is sort of moving in and out of the room over the course of the night, thinking that this all must be going very well and an engagement must be imminent between these two people. But of course we know very different. And Trollope very hilariously describes when the moment she realizes that this engagement isn't going to come off and isn't going to happen, that she discovers the acres of Greshambury were not to be reclaimed by the ointment of Lebanon after all. And I love that description of her discovery of this. Then in chapter 21, Frank's parents reinforce the idea that he must marry for money to bring money back to their estate and support their name and their estate. And we get a description of how Frank goes back to Cambridge to study, having failed in obtaining the hand of Miss Gresham in marriage. And then we get a description of Mr. Moffat delaying his marriage to Augusta though she's not really at all bothered about this delay in the marriage because she doesn't have any strong affection for him, though she does love this arrangement and, you know, sort of approves of this societal arrangement that's going to be made in their marriage. And then we find out that Mr. Moffat has cancelled the marriage altogether. And we get a very funny scene where Frank is very upset on behalf of his sister, and so schemes with his friend Harry to obtain a whip to teach Mr. Moffat a lesson. And this is another scene where I think Trollope is poking fun at Mr. Moffat, because we get this refrain in the narrative where he describes poor Mr. Moffat, and but we know that Trollope is really looking down upon Mr. Moffat. And of course it's awful, the violence of Frank whipping Mr. Moffat, but Trollope also treats it as quite a comical scene. And even though Mr. Gresham comes to sort of chide Frank for his actions, we get a description of how he's really well pleased with what Frank has done on behalf of his sister. And we got a lot of debate in the Big Read group and the Trollope Society about whether, you know, it was right that Frank made this action, or if, you know, this violence was should be condemned and was sort of wrong. And so I think it's interesting the different ways we get of looking at this. And also there's a lovely line in this this chapter 21 that I want to quote, just because we happen to be reading this novel in the month of February, and in London at least it is very cold in the city at the moment. And so this quote seems very fitting, where Trollope says, "February is certainly not a warm month, but with the rich it is generally a cozy, comfortable time. Good fires, winter cheer, groaning tables, and warm blankets make a fictitious summer, which to some tastes is more delightful than the long days of the hot sun." And I just love that description, because it just seems so apt. And it's a wonderful thing about reading, that sometimes you get these coincidental relationships that you can have with the text because of the time and place you happen to be reading the novel. In chapter 22, we go back into the politics and the question of the petition about Sir Roger being elected, and he is found to be guilty of bribery, or Mr. Romer is found to be guilty of bribery, who is representing Sir Roger, and so Sir Roger loses his seat in Parliament, and he's really devastated about this, because although he has substantial wealth, he doesn't have the political position and power that he desires, and this partly drives him back to drinking. And we know that Sir Roger has a very bad drinking problem, which it's very heavily foreshadowed is going to be the end of him. We also get a glimpse here of how Lady Scatcherd realizes that she can do nothing to prevent drink being the death of him. So in chapter 23, Trollope playfully reintroduces Dr. Thorne into the narrative, because we haven't really seen him since, you know, the beginning of these sections that we were talking about in chapter 13 and chapter 14. And I love how Trollope self-consciously steers his narratives in this way, and self-consciously talks about the heroes of his book, and how Dr. Thorne, you know, obviously the novel being named after him, is the real hero of the book, but we haven't seen him for a while. So I like how he reintroduces him into the story in this way. And we also get a snippet of Trollope reflecting on the injustice of women being not expected to feel romance or love before marriage. And I think this is another sign of the really sympathetic way that Trollope portrays his female characters in his novels. And the squire apologizes for Mary's banishment, because he realizes that it's really wrong that they're not allowing her to come back to the Greshams, and he reflects upon how she'd really be an ideal match for Frank if it wasn't for her being a bastard and not having the societal clout and the money to back her position to be a good match for his son. And so I think that's a little sympathetic glimpse into into Mr. Gresham as well in the story. And we get news of Sir Roger's illness and Dr. Thorne being called back to treat him again, and Dr. Thorne once again relishing how if Mary was to marry Frank and to become an inheritor of Sir Roger's wealth, then wouldn't that show the Greshams? And you get this sort of delicious sense that Dr. Thorne really wants to stick it to the Greshams for snubbing his ward Mary in this way. And then chapter 24, Mr. Rearchild and Dr. Thorne go to treat Sir Roger, who is basically on his deathbed. And Lady Scatcherd is informed of her husband's imminent death. And Trollope gives another little sympathetic insight into the lives of women in this, and how it, in a jaded way, it's sort of assumed that a wealthy widow will be glad about her husband's demise, but how Lady Scatcherd really has a great affection for her husband and is devastated that he is on the brink of death. And I think he shows her in a really sympathetic light, and again is sympathetically showing his female characters in the state of women in this way and at this time. And we also get more about Sir Roger's son Louis in this, about his failed academic career and how he's really wayward and sort of drinking and a lot like his father, and is consorting with people that Trollope describes as blacklegs, and becomes that most odious of all odious characters, a closed-fisted reprobate. And I love that description, in that we get a bit more about Louis in this, and how even though Louis and his mother go to his side when he's very sick, Sir Roger is still requesting more alcohol at this point. And so I think Trollope is really showing, the effects of alcoholism, how pernicious and long-standing it is, even though when people are very ill, they still have this strong desire to drink. And that's where it ends at the end of chapter 24. And even though I haven't read on yet, at the very start of chapter 25, we get the heading that Sir Roger dies. So I guess that is what is coming next, even though it's not a very big surprise. Like I said, it's very heavily foreshadowed and basically shown to be an inevitability in this story. But like I've said before, and other people have said before in the Big Read group, you don't read Trollope so much for the plot, I don't think, though the plot is very interesting and I'm really eager to find out what is going to happen in this story. But you read him a lot more for his excellent characterizations and his depiction of the period and the society at the time, and that's what I'm really enjoying about reading his books. So I'm eager to see what happens next, and to read more of this book and continue on with the Big Read, because it's really enhanced my reading experience doing this read-along and hearing other people's thoughts and opinions about this book. Some other people who have read this for the first time, and other people who have read it numerous times and are still finding more in the text, and are clearly enjoying the experience. So thank you for listening to me talk about these sections, and thanks to the Trollope Society for inspiring us to read or reread Anthony Trollope.